In this video, I'm going to show you the complete build process for making this oval tabletop. We'll go step by step through the process from raw materials to this finished product that will transform this poker table into a conference table. Square cuts are easy, but making an oval is a bit more challenging, especially the apron. You'll see exactly how I lay out and cut a nice clean oval, my tips and tricks for applying a veneer, avoiding some mistakes that can ruin your tabletop in the middle of the build. So if you ever wanted to learn how to build an oval table, level up your finishing process, or you're just curious why a table would be built without legs, you're in the right place. Let's get building. The first thing I did was to trace the shape of the poker table onto a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood. That would become the template for making the whole table cover. Then I took it back to the shop and extended the profile by a 1/4 inch all the way around. The straight cuts were a piece of cake, but the curved ends were a bit more challenging. I wanted to see if there was a way I could make a nice repeatable curve, so I fashioned this highly sophisticated large compass. I don't get why that didn't work. My next thought was to mark the radius around a center point. That's when I discovered that this isn't actually a half circle, it's an ellipse. I feel like there's a dad joke in there somewhere, but I got nothing. I used the offcut from one end to trace the profile to the other end. Once I smoothed out the edges, I could use a flush trim bit to copy that curve onto 4 layers of MDF that would become the bending form for the ends of the table apron. I wanted the inside of the apron to have a solid wood appearance, so I resawed some poplar and then planed it down to thin enough to bend without breaking. About 1/8 of an inch. That's about perfect. You've probably never seen this stuff before. I really wanted to use bendy plywood to laminate in layers around the curves, but I had a dickens of a time finding any. None of my local stores carry it, and shipping sheets of bendy plywood from any distance was cost prohibitive. What I found instead was this Bendy MDF. That's fun to say. It has thin kerf cuts at even intervals. It comes in 2 feet by 4 feet sheets that I cut down to 3-inch strips and laminated 3 layers of that to the poplar. The MDF bending form is lined with packing tape so the glue won't stick to it. I used Titebond Extend glue because I figured I'd need the extra working time. The poplar is a little springy, so I hope the glue will help the curve hold its shape once it's dry. Okay, let's see if this is going to hold its shape.
That's a lot of MDF.
These sat in the forms for at least 24 hours. I got a little nervous when I saw wet glue still at the bottom.
Hey, it's holding its shape.
It worked out just like I planned. The next step was to get the solid poplar straight pieces to be the same thickness as the curved ends. Perfect. Okay, so now I got my template brought back out and just matching up the curved ends to it. The next step is getting the correct length for these side pieces that'll span between the curves. I cut them extra long, obviously, so I could do that. You notice there's a bit of spring in these. They did spring out a little bit, and that's okay. So I can use a long clamp to just kind of match them up to the template. This is the line where the bending form went to. I knew these ends weren't going to be perfect with the glue up, so I'm going to have to trim this so that it's even across, so that we're equidistant between the curves on both sides. So to do that, I'm going to use my track saw and just make sure that it's parallel across. Working with curves is tricky. I'm just going to trim off the least amount that I can and get it straight across with this guide. Do that to both curves, and then I'll be able to get my length for the straight pieces. Once I got my measurement, I gang cut them at the miter saw so they would be the exact same length. Next, I marked out where the floating tenons would go to join these pieces together. This project really tested the limits of my small shop. I feel like this contraption could use some explanation. This jig allows me to use the plunge router to cut repeatable mortises for the floating tenons. Kind of like a domino, but way cheaper. Here's what this handy little jig does. The dovetail clamps lock the workpiece into place, and these other pieces lock into the jig so I can make the same cuts in both pieces. I just have to make sure that the inside is facing the jig. I made a video detailing how to make this jig. You'll find a link on screen or down in the description if you're interested. That the inside, that'll go right in the same spots. With the apron completed, I got to work drilling countersunk holes for the machine screws that would hold the apron to the tabletop. It's really important to get these threaded inserts to seat properly. Otherwise, you might have difficulty getting the screws to thread. And to keep them from spinning free, I locked them in with some thin CA glue. With the apron firmly attached to a sheet of 1-inch birch plywood, I routed a groove about half the depth with a straight bit on my trim router, using the apron itself as an edge guide. You can see that the tabletop came just shy of 48 inches across. Then I finished the cut with a jigsaw, being careful not to cut too close to the inside of the groove. Did I say that this project really tested the limits of my small shop? I used a compression bit with a double bearing to flush trim the jigsaw cut. You can find links to all the tools and materials I used in this project in the video description. My flush trim bit dug in a few spots, and I discovered why now. You can see the burning here as I approached there, and you can see the burning on the bit. There's a double bearing and a luck nut on the end, so these can be taken off and cleaned or even replaced. This is the same bit I used to trim the MDF on the bending forms, and it got a little burnt doing that. I think what happened was these started to seize and wouldn't spin freely. So now I've got these gouges in the edge of my table, so I need to repair that. I've got a few different options I could go with. Good old plastic wood, which would fill the gap, but I'm afraid it would dry kind of crumbly, and I don't want it to fail over time. Another solution would be a 2-part epoxy. This one is a little gooey, and I'm afraid it would sag on this vertical surface as it cures. This is what I think I'm going to go with. This is also a 2-part epoxy in more of a putty form. It's got 1 part in the middle and a 2nd part wrapped around. You just slice off the amount that you need and squish it together and spread it in. And it takes about an hour to cure before you can sand it. All visible surfaces are getting a red oak veneer applied. This one has a pressure activated adhesive on the back, so you just roll it on with as much pressure as you can muster. To get a nice joint, I overlapped the adjoining strips and made a square cut through both pieces. Not bad. The grain even kind of matches. From this point on, I didn't want to damage anything by trying to flip this beast on my own, so my daughter was nice enough to help me. I really need an assembly table, and I do have plans to build one, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. But for now, my table saw and adjustable sawhorses will have to do. I have a video about how those are made as well, complete with plans if you want to make your own. I'll link it for you.
That was easier than the first time we did it.
Lightly marking with a pencil helps me make sure I sand all areas evenly. I cleaned off the dust with denatured alcohol so the veneer would make a good adhesion. Some people use a razor knife to trim the excess, but I think the flush trim saw leaves less of a chance of making a stray cut. The edge banding is a bit thicker than the roll-on veneer, and it has a heat-activated adhesive. A lot of people will use an iron for this, but a heat gun and a roller works just as well. This two-sided edge band trimmer makes quick work of trimming off the excess on top and bottom at the same time. Sanding your project doesn't make for the most exciting video, but it's such an important aspect for achieving a quality finish. This veneer isn't very thick, so you have to be careful how aggressive you are. I started with 120 grit, followed by 180 and 220. Raising the grain by spritzing it with water and allowing it to air dry between each grit. I went with General Finishes oil-based gel stain in Java, which I think produces a richer dark brown than their dark walnut. And the gel stain allows you to have better control on these vertical surfaces, so it doesn't run all over the place. I used a tack cloth to wipe off any remaining dust before applying the stain. You don't have to be super careful with the application as long as you cover all areas generously. With a big project like this, the key is to work quickly so the stain doesn't sit too long. No more than about 15 or 20 minutes before wiping off the excess. Otherwise it'll start to get tacky and gets harder to wipe off. You can do additional applications if you want it darker, but be careful with that because it gets harder to achieve an even coloring when you overlap. Just in case you haven't heard this before, spontaneous combustion is a real thing. Be sure you don't wad up your oil-soaked rags when you throw them out. Spread them out in single layers to dry before disposal. You'd hate to wake up to the smell of your shop burning down at 2 o'clock in the morning. I am so frustrated with myself right now. I just caused myself a whole bunch more work because I wasn't as careful as I thought I was sanding. I popped the grain with water, I went through all the grits. I thought I was doing a good job. When I ran my hand over it, I could kind of feel that it wasn't quite as smooth in the middle as it was on the edge, but I ignored that. And then when I was running over it with the tack cloth, I could kind of feel it drag a little bit too. Ignored that, shouldn't have. Here in the middle, it just wasn't as smooth as the edges. Applying stain wasn't really a big issue, but then when I went to wipe it off, the fibers in the cloth were catching on the fibers in the wood, especially in the tight grain here. There's a whole bunch of little sharp ends that caught the cloth fibers and left a bunch of big fuzz balls. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the veneer being rolled up in the box. I never encountered this with solid wood. Another issue that happened is maybe you can see on the video here, it's a little darker over here than it is everywhere else because the stain sat there a little bit longer. Not a lot longer, but a little bit, and that was enough. You might be able to see on the edge here that it's a little bit lighter on the curves. Probably can't see it back there, but it's there too. Not as pronounced there as it is here because, you know, I went across this way with sanding, but then I hit the edge like an extra time for whatever reason, and that was enough of a difference to change how much stain was being absorbed. So sanding is just crucial when applying stain. I hate stain. I try to avoid it, but this project, it was necessary. The customer wanted a dark walnut finish. This is, you know, birch plywood covered with oak, so that it could have a nice stained finish because Baltic birch just doesn't stain that great. It's kind of blotchy, but I have to be very careful with how much sanding I do because this veneer is very thin and I cannot get down anywhere close to the glue level because that would just be a disaster. I'd have to, like, I don't know, re-veneer it or something. Yeah, so I'm just kind of trying to figure out how many grits to even how far back. Do I go to 80? Do I go to 100, 120? Where do I start? I got to bring it back to a 220 finish and get all these areas even so that it'll stain evenly. I just created hours more work for myself by not being careful about being ready to add stain. So, say a prayer for me. I didn't want the sandpaper to tear out these thin fibers, so I took the time to slice off the dingleberries with a razor before sanding. This second attempt at staining came out much more evenly. Quality sanding makes all the difference. I'm not going to sand after the stain and before adding any finish because I don't want to sand through the stain, which would be really easy to do, and then have to go back and touch up areas. When I asked the guys at my local Rockler what they thought would be best for a tabletop finish, they recommended Armor Seal, which is General Finish's oil-based wipe-on varnish. They also recommended Seal-A-Cell as a first coat to help even out the stain. That bit didn't make sense to me. Wouldn't that prevent the stain from absorbing? So instead I'm using the Seal-A-Cell on top of the stain after it's had a day to dry.
Or proud or rude, and it doesn't demand its own way. It's not irritable. Lord, you are so loving. We pray that the Twin Cities would know of your great love, that you are patient and kind. You don't demand your own way, but you invite people to live your way. It's the path to life. So we just pray that you pour out your spirit, pour out your love on those, on everyone, but especially those who don't know you, Father, that they would be drawn closer to you here in this new year. I know how good you are. In Jesus' name, amen.
I might not have let this stain sit long enough. It's been about 17 hours, but I probably could have used an entire day. Some of the stain is coming up as I wipe it off. Oops. My daughter wasn't available, so I asked my friend Mike the Machine to help me.
Ready? Yep. So much easier with you. I try.
Now, the client said he didn't want a glossy finish. The least glossy in the oil-based is satin. Thankfully, I did some research first because I found out that satin has drying agents in it that make it dry really fast. Almost too fast for a large project like this one. You can see that the satin is cloudier than the gloss. That's because of the drying agents. So to prevent my finish from becoming too cloudy or streaky, I'm going to apply 3 coats of gloss first before finishing with 2 coats of the satin. The gloss will give me more working time to get the first coats on, and it'll penetrate deeper. Hopefully you'll see what I mean as I'm applying it. I'm using a cloth-covered sponge and a squeeze bottle for better control and speedier application. The directions on the can say to apply it heavy and then go back and wipe off the excess, but I think that would be a mistake. If you've ever applied a polyurethane, you probably learned that you don't want to rework an area because it'll kind of gum up on you. Just lay it down as evenly as you can with a slight bit of overlap and then let it settle. I'm letting each coat dry for a day before light sanding and applying the next coat. I'm going to apply all 5 coats to the underside before flipping it over one last time to finish the top. The first coat of gloss goes on a little heavier than the subsequent coats, so it has a chance to sink in. Again, I'm applying it as evenly as possible with a slight overlap. You'll notice the little bubbles that form on the surface. That's the oil displacing the air in the wood. Don't worry, they'll disappear as the finish levels itself out. You can test for dryness the next day with a cotton ball. If it sticks at all, you need to let it cure a bit longer. For sanding between coats, I'm using a purple Scotch pad, which is the equivalent of a 600 grit sandpaper, and a light touch. Even at warp speed, this is taking too long. I have a better idea. It's important to remove all of that dust with a vacuum or compressed air and a tack cloth before applying the next coat. For the first coat, the sponge was fine, but it holds a lot of material and it's kind of a waste. On these next coats, I want to lay them on as thin as I can get. I just want to wet the surface. So instead I'm going to use a cotton painter's cloth wrapped around this applicator pad so the little bristles don't get stuck in the finish. This time there are no bubbles. This is how it looks after the third coat of gloss and before the first coat of satin. As you can see, it's pretty glossy, but it's dry. Now comes the first coat of satin. I'm only doing 2 coats of this, which will be enough to bring down the sheen. Watch how fast this dries. Obviously, this is a time lapse of 10 seconds, which was only 10 minutes in real time. It's not dry to the touch at this point, but it's dry by appearance. Here's what the dry satin looks like. The Scotch pad wasn't getting as smooth of a result as I wanted, so I switched to 400 grit sandpaper wrapped around a Scotch pad for final sanding before the last coat. For the final treatment, I'm going to rub it down with a brown paper bag, which is the equivalent of about 1200 grit. Then I'm just going to let it sit and cure for about a week before getting help carrying this completed poker table cover up the stairs. I really appreciate you watching this video all the way through. I hope it was helpful for you.
Good. Nice.
That looks a lot better.
Yeah.
Instantly just transforms the room.
It did.
Wow.
Nice upgrade.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching.